Okay, my name is Paul Milliken. I'm Secretary of the Anthony Powell Society. I'm delighted that today I'm joined by Lady Antonia Fraser and Harry Mount. Antonia Fraser, of course, is a distinguished historian, biographer, writer of mystery novels, and Lady Violet Powell is her aunt. So we're taking the opportunity today to get Lady Antonia's recollections of her memories of both Anthony Powell and Lady Violet. And Antonia will be in conversation with Harry Mount, who is also related to the Powells, but is now editor of the Oldie, as well as an established writer in his own right. And let me hand over to you, Harry, to begin the conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Paul, and welcome all members of the Anthony Powell Society, and any non-members. I can recommend it as a fantastic society. I'm talk to Antonia about Uncle Tony and Aunt Violet, which is what we both called her, I think. And so I'll begin, Antonia, by asking, Uncle Tony and Aunt Violet got married in 1934. You were a mere baby at the time, so you won't remember the marriage, but do you remember when you first met Tony and
Violet? I think that they were quite a lot younger than my parents. You know, in terms of those days, and I don't really remember them until I was sort of in my young teens, and then I met them, and then after I left school rather early, in my opinion, having reached the top of the school, if not the schools, my parents lived in Hampstead Garden suburb, which I greatly disliked. Because nobody would take me home in a taxi. No boy would take me home in a taxi because it was outside the limit. And so I ascribed my social failure to this. And so I wanted somewhere to stay in London. And Violet, who was a tremendously generous woman, as you'll probably remember, sort of warm-hearted, took pity on me and took me and gave me a room whenever I wanted it on the top floor of the house in Chester Gate. And that way I got to know them in a sort of very easy, lovely way. Tristram was quite young. John was even younger. And I felt very much at home. At the same time, I felt free. And we used to have breakfast. And then there was the moment, which of course I now treasure, because Violet would say, Antonia, would you mind backing up and finish your breakfast? I want to clear the table so Tony can write his novel. And do you know what the novel was?
Well, you tell me.
The novel was, he'd just begun to write Dance to the Music of Time. He began writing it in Chester Gate before moving to the Chantry.
And so in terms of dates, the first volume of Dance comes out in 1951, but this was sometime before that you were lodging with them, is that right?
It's more like 48, 49. I can't be precise, but it was before 1950 when I went to Oxford.
And of course, Uncle Tony wouldn't have said, do clear away the table, I'm about to embark on a 12-novel sequence, but did he reveal at all what he was writing in that first volume?
No, absolutely not in any way at all. And I can't, as a historian, I must not invent, and I won't. I chiefly remember the need to get out. You know, it wasn't a sort of option, I think I'll have another bit of toast. And he had to do this thing, which was very unlike what my own parents did. My father was a don at Oxford, and he cleared out of the house. He didn't work at home. He went to Christchurch, or so he said. And so I was rather fascinated by someone who worked at home on the table. And I got the impression that this was a nice life. You know, it struck me as rather better than my father striding away through North Oxford. And I was very impressed by it, but I never had a literary conversation with him at all, although he was very nice to me. He was a very kind, nice man in that way, nice to the young.
And so did you then cleared off during the day, did you? And then came back in the evening, and obviously Uncle Tony had done his his work by then. Is that right?
Yes, I came back in the evening. To be honest, my aim was to be taken out by people, and I think I was at that point, because my mother got rather fed up with the fact I'd left school so early. I did go to the lycée, which was in South Kensington, and I had a job in Phoenix hat shop, anything, keep going. So I was really, the breakfast was the main time.
And to go back to your parents' generation, Aunt Violet was quite a lot younger than Uncle Frank, your father, Lord Longford. I think she was 7 years younger than him. My grandmother, Julia Pakenham, and Violet, I think, were referred to as the babies. So there was quite a big age gap. Were Violet and Frank close, do you think?
I don't think they were particularly close because they were so separate, in age, as you've said. My father went to a boarding prep school and then to Eton. And Violet had quite a different kind of schooling, as was common at that time. And she didn't go to Oxford, unlike your grandmother, Julia, who did. I don't think they were particularly close. Tony and my father were exactly the same age, both born in December, I think. I mean, Tony, was he born in December?
Yes, he was. Yes, yeah.
1905. My father was December the 5th. Tony was around you tell me.
later in the month, going on the Society's wonderful birthday gatherings. But yes. So had close at Eton and Oxford.
So but they didn't. I mean, they knew each other, but they weren't the same type. They didn't have the same interests. And my father, in my view, making a great mistake, didn't read Tony's novels, whereas my mother read them and loved them.
Well, that brings me on to the suggestion, which may be a terrible urban myth, that Uncle Frank suggested that Widmerpool was based on him, and he could only have said that if he'd never read the books. But it's true, he said that.
Well, I never heard him say that, and I don't quite see. It seems rather odd to say that about a character you've not read. I think it's more likely that someone said it to him, and he then repeated it to cover up the fact he hadn't read the books. Because as you say, Harry, no one could read the books and think Widmerpool had any connection to my father.
Exactly. And actually, I would have thought if there was a figure, it would be Eridge. Yes, yeah. I don't know if you think that's true. Do you think that there are similarities?
I think there were similarities with Eridge, but it may have been part of Tony's brilliance to see the way my father was going to go, because I think he created Eridge before my father had become a great, for instance, prison reformer. As I said, my father was a Don and then a Labour minister, which was a different way of life. He wasn't, I mean, he didn't become Earl of Longford until 1961, you see. So I think perhaps Tony sensed something about my father, how he might become, but I don't think because of chronology, I don't think he actually based Eridge on him. But Eridge was certainly much more like him than Widmerpool.
Yes. And to go back to Aunt Violet, she was a very, very affectionate, loving figure. You grew pretty close to her in Chestergate, is that right?
Well, I think so. And then, of course, the moment they moved to the Chantry, I was asked to stay. And then when she came up, and this was also true of Tony, Violet used to come up and stay at some club, and we used to have lunch together. And she was really something very exciting to me, which is an adult friend. She became my friend. And I think the fact that she wasn't particularly close to my parents, but liked them, it made it easy for us to have this friendship, which was precious to me and remains precious to me, the memory.
She's very gentle, forgiving figure that I believe you did something terrible with some nail varnish. Is that right?
Well, this is typical of Violet, and I'm afraid slightly rather typical of me. When I was staying with them, I had a bright nail polish. I'm 16, perhaps, called Pink Plum Beautiful, which I thought would make me extremely desirable. And one day I was putting Pink Plum Beautiful on my nails, and it missed my nails and went all over the dressing table in this room that she'd so kindly let me have. And I went without telling her. That wasn't on purpose. I was in a hurry, late, and so I didn't tell her. And then I went back, and I didn't see her, and I spent the night. And in the morning, I said, "Violet, I've got something terrible to tell you." And she said, "It's quite all right, darling. We cleared it all up." I said, "No, that's not it. The fact is, I've done it again."
Well, that's
she forgave me.
Yes, and she eclipsed in the story of Anthony Powell because she was a distinguished writer in her own right. Did you see them or hear them discussing about writing, not necessarily dance, but
no, I didn't. They discussed people endlessly, and in a very interesting way. I can't honestly say I heard them discuss writing, and I never heard Tony refer to Violet's works, actually. Obviously, he read them, but just not in my presence. They were people, was what they liked talking about. They liked asking me about, my generation, my friends who were sons and daughters of their friends. That always interested Violet. She liked those connections.
And that comes out in both their books. There's a tremendous curiosity, really, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I mean, Tony was truly interested in genealogy, but not in any kind of snobbish way. I always get annoyed when people say he was only interested in dukes, because the most interesting conversation we had was when I told him I was going to write about Oliver Cromwell. And he said, "You should refer to him as Williams throughout." So I was very much taken back by this. Many things you could say about Cromwell. I hadn't expected this. And he said, yes, he was Welsh and he was actually Ap William, and his real name was Williams. And his father changed the name because Thomas Cromwell was on the up, who was his brother-in-law. Of course, that was a bit of a mistake. And then he knew all about that. Then he said, couldn't you refer to him as Williams instead of Cromwell? So I was going to call my book Cromwell, Our Chief of Men, after Milton's sonnet. So I said, Tony, I don't think Williams, Our Chief of Men, will sound quite so good. He didn't agree with me.
And also that comes across in the war books in dance. He was completely interested in soldiers, Welsh soldiers in the war, isn't it? That it wasn't, I think I agree with you about the snobbery, but there is a funny story about you at his birthday with Jilly Cooper, which is a jokey story about snobbery.
Well, this wasn't his birthday. It was to celebrate the last volume of Dance. And he was very keen, in the nicest possible way, on Jilly Cooper, and she was very keen on him. She was a very interesting person, and he could see her, not only her charm, but that she was clever, and he just liked her. So that the publisher, Roland Gant, I think, put her on his right, and I was put on the left. And Tony said, as long as I'm alive, an earl's daughter will sit on my right, and insisted on us moving. So Jilly was on his left and I was on his right. So I was sort of not displeased by this. He then proceeded to talk to Jilly for the rest of lunch.
How funny. And go back to those Chester Gate years. My uncle, your cousin, Tristram Powell, Uncle Tony's son, who's been very interestingly interviewed by the Society, said he had no awareness as a boy growing up of his father being a famous writer. Did you have that either in Chester Gate, and if not, when did that begin to develop that he was this considerable figure?
I think I certainly had no idea. Well, he wasn't a famous writer when I was in Chester Gate. Actually, he was a very good writer and a well-known writer. I wouldn't have thought in the 40s he was famous. I thought he became famous in the 50s, wouldn't you?
Yes, possibly when the volumes begin to accumulate.
Yes. Well, when I was at Oxford, I had sort of other interests. I was reading history, and I wasn't really thinking about novels at the time. But when I left Oxford, I worked for a publisher, George Weidenfeld, and then I immediately realized that he was a famous writer. You know, it was a name that everybody greeted with enormous respect, and was deeply impressed when I said I knew him, that he was my uncle by marriage. So, and I worked for George from the age of 21 onwards. So from then on, I realized.
And as a publisher and a journalist, which Uncle Tony was as well, he was extremely good at spotting talent. He spotted Kingsley Amis and Philip Larkin very early on, and of course was a great friend of George Orwell's. Was there any aspect of literary life in Chestergate when you were there, if not them, but of literary people, Malcolm Muggeridge as well, coming to the house?
I think Muggeridge lived very close, from memory. Yes, but you see, I think I really became, it was when I used to go and stay at the Chantry, or they came up to London and I saw them, that I understood and was sort of more in their literary life. And I was working for a publisher. I'm obviously a little older. And then Sonia Orwell worked for George Weidenfeld at the same time as me. And Tony had, I think, been a witness at the Orwell wedding. Am I right?
I think that's right. And I think he also arranged the funeral near Chestergate, I think.
Yes.
Yes. Well,
yeah. Thanks, Paul. Yeah.
I'm sure many of the members of the society will know, but I'm sure he did. But then going to stay at the Chantry, and also, you know, in these wonderful rooms full of books. And then when he used to come up to London, he used to take me to lunch or tea at the Travellers Club. And he was tremendously interested in everything that was going on, and had always seen somebody fascinating to me. And at one point, he used to, when Violet didn't necessarily come up at the same time, somebody had to look after the cat, you know, and sometimes I would come when he was having Kingsley Amis to dinner, you know, that kind of thing. I was very fortunate.
I think he came to London, go to the Travellers to see you, and to go and see his dentist, also our family's dentist, Mr. Sussman, as well. Great.
He came to see his dentist, quite frankly. I was he certainly didn't come to see me, but you see, because we were friends, I mean, the most wonderful time was in 1961 when I went on a Hellenic cruise with them, which quite a lot of it, you know, in a way, appears in Temporary Kings.
Yes.
And I just had my third child. It was such a treat going with them. And Violet was, Tony was interested in absolutely everybody, and made up a little sort of histories for them, you know, which he liked chatting to me. And then I made a complete fool of myself, because he said, shall we use character names, sort of code characters from Scott Fitzgerald? So I nodded, trying to impress. And he said, you see, if we've got code names, we can discuss them without people realizing. And there's one Scott Fitzgerald character where a woman, a girl, has what to us is a man's name. Is it something like Elliot? You would know.
I remember.
Something, it was some name which in England is a man's name. And so all this exciting coded conversation came to an end when I kept referring to he, and the character concerned was actually a woman. So I clearly knew nothing about Scott Fitzgerald. In fact, I hadn't read a word.
Yes. And you went to Venice, is that right, with Uncle Tony and Aunt Violet?
I went to, yes, our Hellenic cruise began at Venice, and I went, there's a scene, I looked it up in my beloved volumes before this conversation. There's a scene where a character looks at the Tiepolo ceiling, and I was actually with Tony when that happened, which makes me very proud.
And you, a historian and a novelist, will think a lot about the what you do with taking real life and turning it into fiction. And Uncle Tony was always annoyed that there might be particular figures who inspired characters in dance. But given that you actually saw things like the Tiepolo ceiling that then appear in dance, could you sort of see him at work, how he would take real life and transform it into fiction?
In a way, but I'm not a novelist, Harry, if you don't mind me saying so. I've written crime fiction, which is slightly different.
Sorry.
I respect novelists too much. But in a way, he said to me, shall we go and look at the Tiepolo ceiling? I want to see it. And I was fascinated to read the book. There was another occasion when I had an opera in my back garden, Mozart, Seraglio, and Tony was doing nothing in London. It was in the summer, and it was put on for a charity, International Social Service for Mixed Race Adoption. I've never forgotten it. And we did Seraglio with rugs out of my window and the orchestra and on the terrace and people on wooden tiers up. At one point, one of my neighbours shouted out of the window, "Can't you turn the radio down?" Which, as there was a full cast. But Tony came to it and didn't sort of say very much. He was very charming. And then a few weeks later, he rang me and said, what sort of conversation what does people say about opera? And luckily I had a review from the Financial Times who sent someone along, and it referred to one character as being more baritone than bass, but when is this character not more baritone than bass? And that actually comes in, I think it's also maybe Temporary Kings, wherever there's a Mozart, he makes it a performance of Mozart, not opera. And Carolo, the musician, is spotted in the front row of the orchestra. So with that, I did see him sort of adapting and getting it right, but then adapting it.
And I think you also saw it in your tutor at Oxford, isn't that right? That there was a connection there. Was she called Anne Whiteman?
One of my tutors at Oxford, who I happen to like very much, called Anne Whiteman, had been on a cruise, I think, with them, and was very, very proud of being Dr. Emily Brightman. As you can see, the name wasn't sort of converted very far, which always amused me. She was very proud of it because Dr. Emily Brightman is a pretty good nightmare, pretty bossy. Anne Whiteman wasn't really, and she was lovely, but she was very proud of her moment of fame.
And do you think when you started to see Uncle Tony and Aunt Violet at the Chantry that his view on life had changed? Because there he'd been in London, right at the heart of London in Regent's Park, and then he was out in the country. Was there a change in his attitude to life?
I wouldn't, you know, when you're 16 and then you go when you're 20, you don't really notice that kind of thing. You know, I was interested in the person. I wouldn't be able to make a judgment, you know.
Yes.
I don't think teenagers see grown-ups in that light, or I didn't anyway.
No, they don't, I don't think. And then how did he get on, Uncle Tony, with and Aunt Violet, with your late husband, Harold Pinter, the famous playwright?
Well, when Harold and I went to live together, we weren't able to marry for 6 years. And of course, I wanted to take them to stay with Violet and Tony, if asked. But as they'd both come and stayed with us and my first husband in Scotland, I wasn't quite sure what line they would take, you know, and I was therefore delighted when Violet said, "You will come and stay with us." Then Tony rang me and said that he'd much admired Harold's play on television, The Lover, which had been on television in 1963. Well, that was fascinating if you know The Lover, because the plot is that a couple are having breakfast and the man says, is clearly well-dressed going to the city, and then says sort of in a very smooth way as he puts his Financial Times away, "Is your lover coming this afternoon?" And she says, "Oh, I think so." And then the next scene, the lover turns up in a sort of extraordinary Hawaiian shirt and sort of jeans, as unlike the city outfit as you could imagine. It is in fact the same man, and the plot is that the man every afternoon dresses up as a lover in order to commit adultery with his own wife, etc. The play. Anyway, it riveted me that Tony liked that play so much. Anyway, then he said, what is Harold? How do we describe him? I said, well, he's my companion. And Tony said, oh, like an old lady. There was a pause. I said, exactly like an old lady. And he roared with laughter. He liked that very much.
And they got on once they got to know each
other. Very
other.
well, very well. I mean, they had things they shared. Well, they both, Harold loved literature, you know, the English language was everything to him. And they also, there was that, and then there was red wine, which another thing that drew them together. No, they got on extremely well, and in London. Tony came to see it.
And some people have compared some of the dialogue in Uncle Tony's pre-dance books, particularly Afternoon Men, in their spareness of the dialogue, to Harold. I'm not saying Harold was influenced by that, but can you see that in some of the earlier books?
Harold certainly wasn't influenced by it because he'd never read Tony. You know, it wasn't the kind of thing. I mean, Harold, you know, without going too far into Harold's heroes were Beckett, Joyce, you know, he wasn't. But I did go to Afternoon Men, the play. I think I went with Tony because he wasn't there for the first night, with James Fox. I think it was the summer of '63, and possibly Georgina Ward. Anyway, I did go. I can't really see a resemblance because Harold was a sort of, Harold's single novel, The Dwarfs, was just what he wrote. That was his novel. And just as I don't think Harold was a natural novelist, I don't think Tony was a natural playwright, but I think he was a very brilliant writer. So I enjoyed it. But I think they were very different in where their heart was.
And I think, Paul, you'll correct me, but I think Uncle Tony wrote several other plays, The Garden God, the rest are wrong. But did you think when you saw the play of Afternoon Men, there was Uncle Tony had a talent for playwriting, or that obviously wasn't his major interest?
Are you asking me?
Sorry, Anthony. Sorry, I think he wrote several plays, Uncle Tony, but that wasn't really his major interest. So
yes, I mean, if he wanted to be a playwright, I'm sure he could have been a great playwright. I think he was interested in the theatre at a period. That was my impression. Thank you.
And to talk about dance, and obviously we're not going to do any lit crit stuff, but you would have seen Uncle Tony and Aunt Violet as the books came out. Did that make a difference? Do you remember the reception for them?
I remember reading the reviews because I loved them, and I remember one story which I didn't witness, but I was told. Like all successful writers, every now and then the reviewers turn on them. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't mean that their books are any less good. It's just the reviewers. But apparently one of them got a very bad review from Jack Lambert, who was a friend of Tony's. And it is said that they met going down the huge staircase at the Travellers Club. And Jack Lambert said, I say, oh boy, I do hope you didn't mind about what I said about your book. And Tony, shaking with that mirthless laughter, said, oh no, oh boy, I don't care what you think about anything. I've always loved that. Game, set and match to Tony.
But did you get a feeling easier for me of a younger generation that when I started reading dance, all the books were there? But did you have a feeling of Oh, how exciting! The new one is out.
Yes, I definitely. I felt excited. They came quite quickly, which pleased me. It wasn't like when you wait for ages. I think it's absolutely remarkable now, looking back on it, how regularly they did come out, don't you?
Yes, yeah, no, it's the whole thing is a extraordinary feat. And do you have a favourite book or a favourite period in the whole sequence?
I do. If I had to pick a favourite book, I think I would pick The Soldier's Art. I like the wartime ones. I mean, I like them all. But I was once asked to pick a favourite, and I picked The Soldier's Art, and I read it, and I thought I was right, and I read it again the other day. In fact, I read the whole of Dance during the first lockdown.
Well, I was going to ask about that. You must have read it many times, and do find yourself having different reactions to it each time you read it. I find as I get older that he's more and more correct about what happens to people as they get older.
Yes, I think that's true. I think I agree. I mean, when I read them earlier when I read them last year, the first half of last year, I hadn't read them for about 10 years. I think I got more engaged. And an odd thing is I got them all on Kindle, thinking this would be easy for going on a walk, you know. And I found after a bit, I had to go read the original books, which I'm lucky enough to have. And I'm so glad.
Because I mean, it's a conversation lots of people have. But what was the difference? Why did you need to have to go?
Well, I'm a tremendous fan of Kindle, by the way, because I'm a quick reader. If I travel anywhere, I have to have my Kindle. So it wasn't anti-Kindle. It was just I found that the actual volumes and the cup, you know, those jackets, and I have to say, not all, but a lot of them were signed by Tony.
Yes,
including one when he came to stay with us in Scotland. He looked at all his books and said, "Shall I sign them?" I said, "Yes, please, please." And one of them happened to say inside it, instead of saying Antonia Fraser, it happened to say Marigold Johnson, who was a friend of mine. So Tony wrote, "This book did belong to Marigold Johnson, but now belongs to Antonia Fraser." And Marigold was furious and said she was going to find Tony and get him to add, but has now been given back to Marigold Johnson.
That's funny. And I think, if you're prepared to repeat this, that Pamela Flitton, who famously was partly based on Barbara Skelton, you had a sudden other thought about her or not?
I knew Barbara Skelton because she was married to George Weidenfeld, my former employer friend, when I was first married to Hugh. We used to have dinners à quatre, which was not easy because Barbara, in my opinion, didn't like women, and therefore, in order to sort of keep going, she flirted with Hugh. Hugh was just married. I like to think very much in love with me, but even so, he said that there was something about her which was so seductive, although she wasn't his type. But he could just see what she was doing. It was quite interesting. And when I was rereading it, I thought again what a seductive but horrible person Pamela Flitton was.
Yes. And in later life, with Uncle Tony and Aunt Violet, did you go and see them a lot? They published, I think, a really interesting book. It was an album to the Dance and Music of Time about all the things that had vaguely influenced the books. But did you go on seeing them right up until that time they both died?
Yes, and as I say, you know, I saw them when they came to London. I mean, I think I saw Violet, possibly not Tony. I saw Violet most times she came to London. She had I think she used to stay in our aunt, after a bit, our Aunt Mary's flat sometimes. And I loved seeing her. And Violet was great company. I said to Hilary Spurling for her admirable biography of Tony, you were never dull with Violet, and you never were. She was so interested in everything, and if she came up, she had half an hour, she'd go to the National Gallery and we'd rather find some fascinating aspect. She was a remarkable person.
And the two of them together, I think somebody described it as a lifelong conversation, but together, when you were three of you together, there was this constant conversation about people and the past. Is that right?
Yes, isn't it Violet in her memoir who said when she got engaged, and so began those conversations which continued for lifelong. And
That's correct. Exactly. Yeah.
I think she said that. I mean,
That's exactly promise. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
It was certainly true. I mean, they always had something to say to each other. I mean, you know, my parents were married very happily for 70 years, but there was something about Violet and Tony. They couldn't wait to see each other again to say, did you realize about Julian, this is imaginary, that actually he's the first cousin of Peter. And therefore, the fact that he looks like Sapphire, etc., you know, they couldn't wait to see each other.
And in terms of the influence on you, your siblings and your parents' siblings and your children are all writers. Lots of them are writers. Do you think Uncle Tony and Aunt Violet had a particular effect on you becoming a writer?
No, I didn't, because I was born, and then I asked the midwife to bring me a pen and a bit of paper, and I began writing shortly after. No, I didn't become a writer. I just was a writer, but I wasn't a good writer. I think people don't realize that to be a good writer or goodish writer, you may have to start being rather a bad writer, but as long as you keep writing. No, what I think I saw from Tony and Violet, what fun the life of a writer could be. And, you know, I think that, and, you know, that this was I won't use the word career because that wasn't the word I felt, but it was a wonderful life because I was a compulsive reader and remained so. That you didn't have to be interested in politics. I mean, people talk about Tony's politics, but all I can say is all the time I was with him, I talked to him. He was very keen on Mrs. Thatcher, but that was interest in her as a character. I never really heard him going on about politics as such, whereas my parents did little else, in my charming opinion.
I think that's an extremely good place to stop. And thank you so much, Antonio, for completely gripping chat about Tony and Aunt Violet. And many thanks to the fantastic Anthony Powell Society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you for being a grand inquisitor.